Hello and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kauchi. Niaga Spotlight goes through the week in business and future affairs, market watch, industries, analysis, and insights. We've got you covered right here on Niaga Spotlight. This week on analysis, we're looking at civil service pension reforms. Now, Malaysia's public pension system has been described as a ticking time bomb. Since 2010, in fact, government expenditure on public pensions has more than tripled from 7.7 billion ringgit in 2010 to an estimated 26 billion ringgit this year in 2024. In a long-awaited attempt at reforming the current system, reducing the fiscal burden, the government recently announced a new pension scheme for newly recruited civil servants, which will see them contributing to the EPF. The move was met with criticism by certain segments, stating it was unfair. Others see it as a necessary means for reform. Today on Niaga Spotlight, we examine the current burden of the public pension system on the national budget, as well as the rationale for reforms. To get an overview of the civil service, the current pension model and proposed reforms, I spoke with Associate Professor Dr. Lau Wee Yap, Faculty of Business and Economics, University Malaya, who has authored several papers on this topic itself. Let's watch. Dr. Lau, thank you so much for making time to join us on Niaga Spotlight. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you.
Fantastic. So let's start off the discussion, Dr. Lau, by looking at when it comes to civil service pension reforms, right? Let's try and frame this accurately first. In your opinion, is the Malaysian civil service bloated, and also looking at the civil service to population ratio and perhaps even comparing it to other countries, if that is useful?
Well, at this point of time, if you look at our numbers, for Malaysia is 1 to 19. And if you compare to some other countries like maybe Indonesia, Korea, for example, like Korea, 1 to 50, and you may say it's bloated, but I put it that way that because Malaysia adopted, if we adopt some of the approach by like other countries, we should exclude the armed forces, police, education, health personnel in the definition of the public sector.
Thanks for framing that. Now, Dr. Lau, moving along from there, so let's look at how financially sustainable Malaysia's current public pension system is. Would you mind perhaps explaining to us what it means to be following a defined benefit pension plan as we are right now?
Okay, for defined benefit pension plan, Malaysia's current public pension system, we may face challenges in terms of financial sustainability due to the factors like aging population and also longer life expectancy. Since our existing public pension system, promise specific benefits upon retirement, regardless of the investment performance. So in contrast, defined contribution programs link benefits to investment performance, potentially offering more sustainability as risks are borne by the contributors rather than the government or employer.
Understood. So basically, this is definitely connected to the way in which JPA, the Public Services Department, has just recently announced that any new civil servants would be appointed on a contractual basis, pending a new policy on hiring civil servants for permanent posts without pensions. Your thoughts on this?
First, I think it is a positive decision because it may reduce the long-term financial liabilities for the government, as the government has promised to apply this to the new hiring. So it means that only additional or future liabilities, may be reduced. So for those who hired right before February 2024, the government still have to pay for the pension, maybe for 30 years. So this reform can only be seen right after 30 to 40 years from now. Given Malaysia's aging population and also declining fertility rate, the decision may reflect an attempt to mitigate the future financial strains on the pension system, but it could also lead to concerns of the retirement adequacy for the civil servants.
Absolutely. Thanks for pointing out a couple of those pointers here. I think I'd also like to highlight that Deputy PM Ahmad Zahid Hamidi has also said that these contracts would be, of course, for a short period before the cabinet approves the formalized full new policy. Moving along from there, Dr. Lau. Now, without such pensions, what would then be some perhaps pull factors for young Malaysians to join the civil service?
Okay, I think without the pension scheme, the government needs to revise a lot of benefits to attract the young talent to join the government service, such as competitive salaries, opportunities for career advancement, and also attractive benefits, And for example, like giving out scholarship to pursue further studies, and existing benefit like golden handshake. I think these are some of the attraction that may be the pull factor for young Malaysians to join the civil service.
Mm-hmm. Well noted on that. Next, Dr. Lau, if we could look at looking at the growing number of beneficiaries under the current pension system. So should the government have explored ending the transferability of pension in efforts to reduce financial commitment instead? Thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think possibility is yes. This might reduce the government financial commitment to the pension system. However, the con is that in terms of civil servants' mobility and retirement planning, such decision would need to be carefully considered in terms of its potential impact on the workforce dynamics, the employees' satisfaction, and the overall retirement security.
True enough. And also QPAX, of course, the umbrella body for civil service unions, has also spoken against the abolition of pension scheme, saying, according to them, that it is the best option. And as EPF contributions are seen as inadequate in helping them to build a substantial retirement fund. Any thoughts on this?
I think in this instance, as I mentioned earlier, that higher contribution rate from the employer part. Okay, and then of course, the staff, the civil servants also must be taught on the importance of financial planning, and then also on financial literacy.
Well noted. Now, Dr. Lau, your perspectives on whether pension reforms should also be followed by reforms of civil service recruitment.
Yes, I think pension reforms should ideally be accompanied by reforms of the civil service recruitment to ensure a more efficient and effective workforce. So recommendation may include introducing competency-based recruitment processes, enhancing career development opportunities, promoting diversity and inclusivity. So streamlining bureaucratic procedures, and also fostering a culture of continuous learning and improvement.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And also for context, almost all civil service hires will actually enter from the lowest grade, and intakes at middle as well as senior management levels are rather rare. Right. Moving on to now looking at, of course, the impact of technological advancements, perhaps like generative AI, which has also become very commonplace in workflows. So, but the impact of this on the future of Malaysia's civil service.
Well, technology advancements such as generative AI could significantly impact the future of Malaysia's civil service. By automating routine tasks, enhancing decision-making processes, improving service delivery, and increasing operational efficiency. So this could lead to reduced staffing requirements for repetitive tasks, allowing human talent to focus on higher value tasks requiring creativity, critical thinking, and also strategic planning. So while this may initially require investment in training and infrastructure, it could ultimately lead to cost savings and also improve performance.
Absolutely. Now, also more employees does not necessarily mean better quality of service, but it's more about employing the best people in the civil service itself. Thank you very much insofar, Dr. Lau, for sharing your opinions and a couple of insights for our issue of civil service pension reforms on Niaga Spotlight. Appreciate your time. Welcome back to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kausji. Now, since the conversation on civil service pension reform began last year, there have been several perspectives and approaches discussed by various economists and stakeholders. I spoke with Dr. Geoffrey Williams, Provost for Research and Innovation at Malaysia University of Science and Technology, whose proposal of a more collective approach for funding pensions certainly merits exploration. Let's watch. Prof. Geoffrey, thank you so much for joining us on Niaga Spotlight. How are you doing today?
Very well, thank you. It's a pleasure to join you.
Thank you once again. So looking at the topic of discussion today, Prof, civil service pension reforms, they're of course under scrutiny yet again with the recent proposal to abolish the pension scheme for new civil service recruits in particular. Will this make the public pension system sustainable, Prof?
I think the simplest answer is it won't, because it will only affect the new hires, and that's a relatively small number of people. Existing civil servants, which can be anywhere between 1.3 or 1.7 million people, depending on how you calculate that, they will still be on the old scheme, which is a defined benefit scheme. And that's not going to change. And what that means is that whatever are the structural problems with the current scheme will still exist, even if the new hires are put on the EPF program.
Mm-hmm. Right. So what would then be the ideation behind wanting to announce this just for the new civil service recruits? Wouldn't that then perhaps have potential new civil service recruits be rethinking their decision to maybe want to join the civil service?
Well, it might do that. I think, there are two sides to it. One is the effect that it will have on recruitment of, as you mentioned exactly, the civil servants who want to join, the new people who want to join, will look at a pay and benefits package, which would be less attractive now than it has been in the past. Unless, of course, the government raise the salaries and make the total package for new recruits similar in terms of the monetary value as it was or as it is at the moment. So there is that side of it. For new civil servants, they will have to look again at the pay and benefits system. But for the government, the idea behind it is that the cost of the retirement scheme for the new people will be lower. And over a very long period of time, as those new people every year replace the retirees, and as the retirees pass away and are no longer on the old retirement scheme, over a very long period of time, then yes, it will help the government to save some money. But it very much depends upon how quickly that replacement goes ahead. Also, remember, the government will still be paying into the EPF scheme. It'll be paying 13% like a normal employer, which is less than it's paying at the moment, because it pays at the moment 17.5%. But it means that the civil servants will also have to pay in. They will have to pay in 11% if it's used. If they use the same scheme as for private employees, then the civil servants will have to pay. And that might mean that the government might have to raise their overall salaries so that they can afford to make those extra payments. And exactly. All of that, anyway, nonetheless, is going to take decades to resolve.
Right. Now, something very interesting that you have also previously mentioned, Prof, and perhaps you could go into deeper detail about this. So what would be a better alternative, perhaps a creation of a super fund? Could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Well, essentially, the system that we have at the moment is a defined benefit scheme, which means that the civil servants will receive a percentage of their final salary. And the question really is, how is this funded? Now, normally, this is funded from the pension contributions, which then go into an investment fund, in this case, KWAP, or for the armed services, it will go into LTAT. And then on the basis of the financial returns, the investment returns of that fund, the pensions can be paid from the dividends from those funds. But what has happened is that the returns on those funds haven't been high enough, and the funds themselves are not big enough. And what that means is that the shortfall has to be paid for by operational expenditures from the government. And that means that the money has to come from taxes and from other sources of revenue, like the Petronas royalty, for example. So it comes out of the basic government revenue. And what that means is that you're taking that money away from other priorities like health and education and social protection and using it to pay for pensions. And it also means that people who don't have a pension who are not civil servants are paying taxes, which are then going to pay the pension because it's being spent from operational expenditures. Now, the alternative to doing that is to set up a bigger fund, which is what I call a super fund. And that is to take the government-linked investment corporations, which are currently underperforming, and amalgamate them into a much larger fund. And that would include KWAP, the Civil Service Pension Fund, and LTAT, which is the Armed Services Pension Fund. It would include both of those. It could also include the National Trust Fund, KWAN, and also Khazanah National, for example. And it could also include some of the other GLICs, the government-linked investment corporations, such as PNB. And if you do that, then you start to get a very large fund. And with a larger fund and a different investment approach, you can then get a bigger set of investment returns on an annual basis. And those investment returns can be used to pay for the civil service pensions, either in part, if it doesn't quite cover the total bill, or in full, depending on how big the fund is and how successful the investment returns are. And that will save all the money from the government operational expenditures. And what that means is that they can spend all of those tens of billions, 32 billion that is budgeted this year. That 32 billion can then be spent on health, education, and social protection, because the pensions would be funded from a super fund.
Exactly. Now, as the super fund, of course, the assets could be even in excess of roughly 337 billion ringgit. Very well explained there. Thanks very much for that.
Well, it could actually be bigger than that. It can be even bigger than that. If you included PNB, it would be about 680 billion. And if you included some other sources of underperforming funds, we can get it up to 1 trillion, if not 1.4 trillion, depending on how ambitious you want to be.
Sure. And that's, of course, staggering and definitely something to be looked at for the far bigger picture and for medium to long term. From there, though, Dr. Geoffrey, I'd like to ask you about the fact that QPAX, meanwhile, the body in charge of, well, basically being the public fronting spokespeople for this, has said the pension scheme is the quote-unquote best option for civil servants and recommended a reset on income pension entitlement for MPs, state assembly people, rather than cutting pensions. Is QPAC's stand, though, sound, and is the suggestion even feasible?
Well, QPACs are there to represent the civil servants, and in that regard, they're doing a good job, because the civil service pension is the best scheme for the civil servants, for sure. But it's not the best scheme in terms of government spending. And that's why we need to look at an alternative scheme, such as taking it away from operational expenditures and putting it into a new super fund. But on the issue of cutting pensions for politicians, it's not going to make a blind bit of difference, actually. The amount of money that is spent on politicians' pensions is tiny. It's trivial. It has absolutely no impact at all on this discussion. And in fact, it would, of course, be much worse, wouldn't it? That politicians would have their pay and their pensions reduced. Wouldn't that make it more likely that they might look for alternative sources of income? And isn't the government trying to close down opportunities for wastage, leakages, and corruption? You know, there was a story about Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore and the Prime Minister here in Malaysia at the time, Abdullah Badawi. And Tun Badawi asked Lee Kuan Yew, why is it there's less corruption in Singapore amongst the politicians and the civil servants than in Malaysia? And Lee Kuan Yew said, because we pay them properly. And if you start cutting the pay and conditions of politicians and civil servants, you're likely to have the unintended consequences that they will look for other ways to protect their pension. And we don't want that. I actually don't think that they are paid enough, actually. If they were paid better, the politicians were paid better, and the civil servants were paid better, then we would have better overall performance. The question isn't about how much they're paid. The question is, how do we fund it? That's the real issue. And I think QPACs would be better advised to support my idea of having a super fund, because that would be a much better, much more stable way of giving their members what they need.
Definitely. Speaking about it being not just fair, but also quite sustainable, which is what is really missing from the entire puzzle at the moment. So let's look at another potential scenario, Dr. Joffrey, for addressing Malaysia's public pensions dilemma. In the meanwhile, as we wait for hopefully your suggestion of a super fund being taken up, aside from the fact how long it would take to set that up, etc. So in the interim, could increasing the retirement age, which currently stands at, of course, 60 for Malaysia, be of any use?
I'm not in favor of that. I mean, I know that pension reform is not an overnight thing. It is a very long-term thing. We all understand that. But even though it's a very long-term process, you have to start sometime, and there's no better time than to start now. So we do need to start now. But if you begin this process of raising the retirement age or increasing the savings rate, you're just going to make things worse in the short term for very little long-term gain. If you increase the retirement age, for example, you just reduce the number of job opportunities available for younger people. So older people will hold on to their jobs for longer. There will be fewer career opportunities for people moving toward their 50s and 60s. They will hold on to the jobs. So people leaving universities who are already unemployed or underemployed. You know that 50% of our graduates are not able to find jobs that require the qualifications that they have. And if older people are holding on to those jobs, it'll make it much more difficult for our graduates to get jobs. So I'm not sure that it will help to increase the working age. And I'm also not sure that it will help to try to force people to save more, because their salaries are just not high enough. And so raising their salaries and making them work longer is, in my view, a very conventional approach, but it's a very lazy approach. And it doesn't work here in Malaysia. There are better ways of doing it. We should not be forcing people to work until they die. People have a right to leave work relatively early and to enjoy their retirement. And I am very much in favor of that, because I'm approaching that age myself. So I'm very much in favor of that. And I think there are better ways of financing it. The question is, how do we finance it?
Absolutely. Very astutely explained. Thanks for that, Doctor. Now, so then overall, what would you frame as being a dignified retirement? And how do we make sure this dignified retirement is possible for all Malaysians, both those who are within and those who are also working outside of the civil service? As, of course, we are far more on the role of being an aging nation. And of course, soon enough, we will be a fully aging nation.
I think that really, when we look at what is a dignified life in retirement, it's very much what is a dignified life when you're working. And that means you, of course, the basic issues are you must have a reasonable and stable source of income, which is at least at a living income level, if not better than that. So you must have a good income level, and it must be stable so that you are secure and you can rely upon that income sources. But it's also true that as you get older, there are new costs that you have to bear. You have to bear more medical costs. You will have to bear costs for care at home when you're getting less able to look after yourself. And so these costs are additional costs that you have as you're older. And so you have to be able to cover that either from your income or through social protection. And that gives people a much more dignified life as they're getting older. And I think the other thing is choice, actually, because many people might want to work and retire at different ages. They don't always want to retire at 60 or 65 or at a particular date. Some people want to continue to work full time for the longest time. I have colleagues who are in their 80s and are very happy to continue to work full time. Others want to move into part-time work. And of course, there are others who want to give up work completely and not work and enjoy their retirement. And that level of choice is important to having a dignified retirement. But choice comes only when you can afford it. So that means that we have to look at the essential issue of where is your pension coming from, how high is your pension, and is it stable? And again, that's a financing issue. Purely in economics terms, it's a purely financing issue.
Very much so. And I think going back to one of the points that you made about the additional costs that come with folks being of retirement age, we must always remain also cognizant of the fact that given Malaysia's very heavy NCD burden amongst adults, so roughly 50% of us as we age in Malaysia can also expect to be spending at least about anywhere between 10 to 15 years living with the consequences of NCDs, which will of course be not just increased medical costs, but also daily costs of living. So all of that, I think, really is pointing back to overall to a much more sustainable system, perhaps such as what you'd explained, could be achievable via the super fund. In essence, Prof. Joffrey,
I mean, if I might just on that point, of course, you're right. You're absolutely right that, but if the money is being spent on civil service pensions, it can't be spent on the things that you've just mentioned, which we know for sure everybody will want to have. Because the thing about aging is it's very easy to predict, because we know the numbers of people who will move into the elderly group and then the aged group. We know that. And it's also easy to predict the type of things that they will need and the cost of those things. And therefore, that's why it's urgent to address, in my view, the civil service pension issue, because if we can release those funds, we can then move those funds into better care for people as they move into the older age group. And then you can rely on the state to do that, either by giving you a higher state pension or by providing it publicly.
Very well said. Thank you very much for your time once again, Dr. Joffrey. I think that was a very nice explanation. Well, that's all we have time for today. This has been Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kauschi. Wishing all our viewers celebrating Lunar New Year, Kong Hei Fat Choi, and an auspicious Year of the Dragon ahead. We'll see you next Friday with more business analysis and insights. Here's to a productive week ahead.